Father Joseph Spence, welcome to Power and Witness, and we just interviewed
Thank
you
you.
on Life on the Rock. We got more work for you to do today. So your two recent books here are Living the Little Way, 6 Keys to the Spirituality of St. Therese, and Learning How to Love with St. Therese, 7 Windows into True Charity. And I know our theology department was really impressed by your books here at UWTN, and you did a number of shows. And so I just wanted to grab you for a podcast, and
Sure.
we can just jump around on different topics. This seems like a mundane question, but why don't we start with first, what is the little way, just for someone who's just being introduced to this?
Good question. It's the message that Therese most wanted to get out there, and it's just that message, of complete trust, surrender to God, abandonment to His mercy, to His love. It's the way of letting God become our sanctity. She said in prayer 6, all of our justice is stained in your eyes, so I beg you, Lord, to be yourself my sanctity. And there's a number of images she uses to describe that as well. For example, the elevator, which she had seen for the first time actually on her trip to Rome when she was 15. She saw the elevators in the hotels, and she would later use that image to describe the little way. So she said, the elevator which will lift me up to you, O Lord, are your arms. So the little way is it's this new way. She talks about a little way, a new way, which leads us to God, which is this complete surrendering and just throwing oneself into God's arms and letting Him be Himself our sanctity.
And would that be like to let Him be our sanctity? I know that Pope Benedict, I remember writing something on holiness, and he talked about holiness as this participation in the mysteries of Christ's life. To let no longer I that live, but Jesus that lives in me, as St. Paul would say. Is that what it means, like that deep communion, that we have union with Him, that He's living His life in us?
Definitely. I mean, I think that's what it's all about. Yeah. It's about letting God be Himself. It's about letting God express Himself in us. It's about leaving the first step to Him. Again, she wrote about that in many ways, but it was, and she was influenced in many ways, in a little way. The goodness and tenderness of her father helped to understand how tender God is. In fact, she wrote, for me, God is more tender than a mother. So the tenderness of her mother Zélie, although she only lived the first 4 years of her life with her, the tenderness of her father, all helped her to better perceive God's tenderness. And I think that's the flip side of the little way. How can you completely abandon yourself into someone's arms unless you trust them completely? And unless they're completely good. So she experienced God's goodness through her parents also, and was therefore able to realize that God is infinitely good, and therefore we can trust Him infinitely. So I think it's it's her experience of God's goodness that is kind of the flip side of her little way. You only trust people who are good and that have been good to you, and so that was her experience, and that's what she lived.
I know your community has a great love for Maximilian Kolbe, right?
Yeah.
And didn't he say something about like this trust we're called to have is to kind of let go of that last but, but Lord, I'll trust you, but.
Definitely. He spoke about love without limits, without limits. And his whole life was just that, really exemplifies that total gift of self, and that's actually the word he uses. I can't say it again in Polish. It's not coming to me, but I don't know Polish, unfortunately, yet. But he talked about when he sometimes wrote in Latin, sometimes in Italian. He would say consecratio in Latin, or consecrazione, or we would say consecration, to God through the Immaculata. That was kind of his ideal, So, but in Polish, actually, the word he preferred was gift of self. So, and he usually wrote in Polish. So he would speak about the gift of self to the Immaculata, to Mary, or to God through Mary, and that was his ideal. That's what he did, and that's what he did in Auschwitz. When he gave his life to save the father of a family.
Right. You have everything. And have you done much study of his work?
Not enough. Not enough. I know him, but not on a scholarly level. And it's interesting also, my founders wrote about this, that Mother Maria Elisabetta Patrizzi, her name was, she wrote this book that is only in Italian, unfortunately, but she called it the Il Patto Segreto, so the secret pact or accord, because Kolbe actually read the Story of a Soul in the first edition in Italian when he was a seminarian in Rome from 1912 to 1919. And he was so struck by the Story of a Soul that he made this secret pact with Thérèse. She was already dead, of course. And so in prayer, he made this kind of alliance. And he said, I will offer Mass every day as one of the intentions for your beatification if you pray for my mission. So they had this kind of secret pact. And when he went to India, trying to open a community there, everything was going wrong and stuff. And he was waiting to meet, I think it was the bishop, and he was kind of murmuring to himself, but really to Thérèse in prayer, saying, well, I've been praying for you, but why aren't you helping me, And then some flower petals in that instant fell on the table from the flowers that were in the vase there. So he said, well, we'll see if this is a sign. So yeah, there was that special friendship with him. And even his brother criticized him for the fact that he would keep a statue of St. Therese in the chapel. And he said, well, we're Franciscans. What are you doing? He said, no.
Well, I had read one time that he had a devotion to like the saints that saw Our Lady. And maybe Our Lady smiling at Therese. Maybe that was part of his devotion.
I don't know if that was a part of it. That could have been. He was devoted to Saint Bernadette for sure. And Therese was also struck by the same apparition, which really struck Kolbe, which is the apparition to Alphonse Ratisbonne in Rome, in Sant'Andrea delle Fratte. That's what inspired Kolbe to found the Militia of Mary Immaculate in 1917. That had happened. The apparition was from 1842. And Therese, when she stayed in Rome, she stayed in a hotel very nearby to that church, and the pilgrims would go to Sant'Andrea delle Fratte every morning for Mass that whole week. And it was there that she learned of this apparition, and that was probably what started her own habit of giving the miraculous medal away to people. So she also would often give the miraculous medal to people.
Can you recount that apparition?
To Ratisbonne?
Yeah.
So so he was a Jewishman. He was French. He would later testify that he had never opened the Jewish scriptures. He had never spoken to people about his Jewish faith. So he was only culturally Jewish. His brother had converted actually long before him, to Catholicism and had become a Jesuit. So Alphonse hated Catholics, and he especially hated Jesuits because of that fact. He had gone to Italy, so that's January of 1842, on a pleasure trip. So he had gone actually to portray his fiancée, who he was about to get married. So he went. He was wasn't behaving himself. He talks about how he had heard the fireworks on January 1st for the New Year from the Mother of God and started blaspheming Our Lady. So he was not doing so well morally, and so he went on a. I'll try to keep this brief, but he went on a kind of a courtesy visit. He was kind of from a noble rung of society, so they have these courtesy visits, So he was hoping that his acquaintance would not respond, but he did. Another Frenchman in Rome, and this other Frenchman had been Protestant, converted to Catholicism. So they're sitting in the parlor talking, and the daughter of this friend of his offered him a miraculous medal, and he refused. So this child started crying, and her dad said, "Well, listen, why don't you just take this gift that my daughter is giving to you, and you don't believe in these things, so it won't harm you. So Alphonse thought to himself, he said, well, this will be a funny joke to tell my friends when I get back to France. So he put the medal on his neck and started praying the Memorare of Saint Bernard that his friend had told him to pray, but for him it was all just a joke. A few days later, he was eating in a plaza. His friend passed by. He said, hey, I can give you a ride. Same friend. Like a long story short, they went to this church. He walked in out of curiosity to see the angels sculptured by Bernini, and he saw a black dog barking at him. He went closer, attracted by a light. He saw the church was all dark except for one altar, was the altar dedicated to St. Michael the Archangel. He suddenly saw this beautiful woman who was Mary, and he said, she did not say a word to me. She only pointed to the ground, and he knelt down. And he said, he would later testify, he said, she never said a word, but I understood everything. The abyss of sin, which I was inside of it, and the infinite mercy of God and Mary who pulled me out, And he instantaneously understood, realized all the mysteries of the Catholic faith that he had never heard about. Like he said, he had never heard about original sin, but he knew what it was after that. Mm-hmm. He had never heard about other things, he realized the Trinity and the baptism and all the mysteries, the Catholic faith. He immediately asked for baptism, and he was told, well, you have to, do the time of preparation. And he was actually baptized by Cardinal Costantino Patrizzi, who was the Cardinal Vicar of Rome at the time when the Immaculate Conception was proclaimed as a dogma, and who also happens to be the great uncle of my founders, Maria Elisabetta Patrizzi. So there's a whole kind of intertwining there. So anyway, maybe to come back to Thérèse, I don't know, but she went there and was struck by that, and Celine testifies to the fact that she was alert in distributing medals to people to sort of facilitate their conversion.
Yeah. I had heard a version. I didn't know if it was true, but like he came out of the church and he just had tears streaming.
Yeah, he was. He was kneeling down and he was crying, and his friend came up to him after a few minutes and kind of gently laid his hand on his shoulder, and that's when he told him something like, "I need to see a priest." So actually, he asked to talk to the Jesuits. So that he asked his friend to take him to the Chiesa del Gesù, the Church of Jesus, which is owned by the Jesuits even today. And that's when he went to confession, he didn't go to confession because he wasn't baptized yet. But he asked to talk with the Jesuit. Yeah. That's when he asked to be baptized immediately. And he said, the Jesuit told him, "Well, that's wonderful, but you have to do the catechumenate preparation." So. Yeah.
And I heard, just like, I guess obviously you see the Blessed Mother, it just really burned into his brain. I guess. Did he ever write about that, her beauty, or what she looked like?
I think he said something like, there was this, I don't know if he mentioned her beauty. I think he mentioned her beauty. Yes, beautiful. He mentions her beauty and also her most merciful hands. Oh. He said that he was not able to look at her face. He said, the extreme dazzling light and his extreme shame both inhibited him from looking at her directly.
Mm-hmm. So, of course, St. Maxime Coley had a great devotion to the miraculous medal. You said St. Thérèse would pass them out as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that apparition, too? I recently went back to look at it to see if they used that term, mediatrix of all graces, but it seemed like that's what they're talking about, right? She's standing there with rings on her finger and light coming forth from her, these rings, right? Uh-huh. Represent grace that people aren't asking for, right?
That's what she said, yeah. I don't think she used that term.
Yeah.
But that was definitely, like, from what I understood, that was kind of their conversation. So St. Catherine Labouré asked Mary, well, she said, "I can never describe the splendor of those rays of light, And then she asked Mary, well, why are some of them turned off? Because there was these rays of light coming from rings on her fingers. Yeah. And Mary responded, "These are all the graces I would love to give, but no one asked them for me, So yeah, definitely. And then she also saw the prayer. So she saw in vision, Our Lady standing on the altar of St. Joseph, actually, in the chapel. And Mary revealed to her in a vision how she wanted the back of the miraculous medal to be as well. So there's the symbol of the cross and a bar which would actually represent the altar, so the sacrifice of the Mass. And Mary, who was present she was present at Calvary, she's present, in every Mass, spiritually. And the 12 stars of the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles, and all of that. Then there's the Sacred Heart of Jesus, the Immaculate Heart of Mary. But so she showed her in a vision, and then there's the prayer, O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee. So yeah, beautiful, beautiful apparition. And only after a few years that it was coined, people started calling it the miraculous medal for all of the graces and the miracles they were receiving. So.
Right. Let's talk about the other story I love about Saint Therese. Was his name Pranzini? Tell us about that.
Definitely. So Henry Pranzini was a murderer, actually on the site of the archives of the Lisieux Carmel, so you can find that online. There's actually a photograph that was taken by the police, so we have his photograph. He's looking very confused and very, very, very dark and somber. So he murdered 2 women and a girl in an apartment in France, in Paris. And Therese soon heard about the fact because it was in all the newspapers, and even more so, it was a family fact in the sense that her cousins, the Guérins, had an acquaintance with one of the women who had been murdered. So they personally knew one of the victims. And she immediately set about praying for Pranzini. She really wanted to obtain his conversion. That's also directly linked, kind of making a short flashback, but to what she called the grace of her complete conversion on Christmas Eve. So she said, I felt charity enter into my soul and the need to forget myself and to please others. Since then, I've been happy. It's another secret to happiness, kind of a recipe that she gives us. Forget oneself to please others, and that's what she did. And so shortly afterwards, it's like a very consequential sequence of events that she explains in just a few lines in her manuscript A, in the Story of a Soul. So right after that, maybe the next Sunday or a couple Sundays down the road, she was looking at a holy card that she kept in her missalette, and it was a picture of Jesus on the cross. And she noticed that his blood was flowing from his wounds onto the ground with no one there to gather that up. And so she resolved to remain at the foot of the cross to gather up that blood. And suddenly she felt this desire to save souls and to slake Jesus' thirst for souls. She said, when Jesus said, I thirst, he was actually thirsting for souls, for their conversion, for their love. And so she decided, she had this thirst herself for souls and wanted to slake Jesus' thirst. So shortly thereafter, she heard about Pranzini and started praying for him. She had masses offered for him, for his conversion, and it seemed that he was not converting. In fact, he did not ask for confession. He went out to be guillotined, and on the scaffolding, just before placing his head into the hole and being guillotined, which he then was, he reached out. There was a priest there, who was offering him a crucifix. So he reached out, grabbed the crucifix, and kissed the wounds of our crucified Lord 3 times. So Therese, it kind of came back full circle. She read that in the newspaper, and she said, I had to hide myself to not show my tears because of her. She was so touched by that. And she felt that the Lord had given her a visible sign of his conversion. She called him her first son. And even afterwards, years later in the monastery, whenever she received money on her birthdays, she would offer masses. She would have masses offered for Pranzini. She would say to Celine, she said, my son must have need of my prayers even now, so I must not forget him.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. The other story, as a priest myself, as a priest today, she traveling in Europe, and she was with some priests, wasn't she, as a teenage girl?
Yep.
And scandalized by their behavior, their conversation, or what's the details of that?
We don't know too much. So she was with, as far as like all the details, she was with 190 2 pilgrims, I think, of whom 75 were priests. So
Wow.
almost half, not quite half. A lot of priests, 75 priests, and she spent more than a month with them on a daily basis all day long.
Did they travel by carriage or just?
They would travel by train and then by carriage in the cities, or by foot. But in the hotels, at the meals, they were always together. And we do know that there was a young priest who was he was the associate pastor at Saint Jacques, I think, which was the parish. They're actually their parish. They would usually go to the cathedral for Sunday Mass, but their actual parish was Saint Jacques, and he was the associate's pastor. Now, Celine was 17 at the time, and Thérèse was 14 going on 15. They were both attractive young women. He was 30, a little over his 30s, I think 32. All we know, I don't think anything in particular happened, but all we know is that he kind of followed them around. So even Thérèse mentioned this in the Story of a Soul. He said, when she describes her visit to Loreto, she said, the priest that was always with us, following us around, celebrated Mass for us in the Holy House of Loreto and gave us communion. So she kind of hints to it. I guess he enjoyed their company more than the elderly ladies. And Thérèse probably found that a bit scandalizing. But the thing is, she never speaks badly about priests.
Yeah. What were some of did she ever talk about the power of the priesthood or the role of the priest or its importance?
Absolutely. Again, I think I mentioned this maybe in Life on the Rock. She said, I'd like to do bulk shopping. So she would pray for priests who would then save sinners. She liked to think of herself, she often expressed herself like this with Celine. She said, the Carmelites and we are called to be apostles of the apostles, kind of like St. Mary Magdalene, apostle of the apostles. And so she said, to save priests who will save souls, thousands of souls, whose mother we shall be, she wrote to Celine. She said, don't you think that our vocation is not enviable to that of the priesthood? So she felt that she was supporting the priests. She was kind of their ally, She also spoke about being like Moses, that famous episode of Moses who was praying on the mountainside with his arms raised up while Joshua was fighting the battle. So she often referred to himself as being like the Moses while the priests were out in the battlefield. She saw priests as missionaries, not only the ones who went onto foreign missions, but also even all priests for her were kind of missionaries, and are called to go out and to save sinners, That's kind of, for her, that's kind of the role of priests, besides, of course, the Eucharist. And she often, there's a very tender note regarding Mary. Oftentimes, whenever she asks Mary to pray for priests or puts into relationship Mary and priests, she always asks Mary to teach priests how to hold Jesus lovingly in their hands, just as she would have, just as she did,
Right.
So she says, Mary, teach the priests even now to handle your son Jesus in the Eucharist just as lovingly as you handled him when he was a child in your arms.
I know I've seen the book, letters she wrote back and forth with a priest in Vietnam. And Vietnam had this terrible persecutions, martyrdoms, you can imagine. What's the story there? How did that priest end up? And I guess, I presume you've read those books. What are some things we could garner from that about her relationship with priests?
Yeah, that's beautiful. So she had the grace of receiving 2 missionary brothers. So they both turned to Carmel, asking that a nun pray for them in a special way. So first it was Maurice Bellière. He was only a seminarian when he asked for that. And actually he was ordained a priest after Thérèse died in 1901. So he was ordained 4 years after she died. But the funny thing is, he went to Africa. That's where he was a missionary with the White Fathers. He arrived in Africa the day after her death, so October 1st, which would then become her feast day. So anyway, that was Maurice Bellier. And then there was Adolphe Rouland, both French priests. And Rouland became a missionary in China. He became a missionary in China, actually. She wanted to go to Vietnam. They had opened the Carmel in Vietnam shortly before. She wanted to go there, but her health did not permit her to do that. Her two missionary brothers were missionaries in Africa and in China. And there's a really fascinating story. I don't want to be too long here, but Father Bellier has a fascinating story of his own. He died at 33 years of age. He went to Africa, was stung by a mosquito. He was bitten by a mosquito, caught malaria, and fell gravely ill, almost died of that. He recovered, but his mental health was no longer the same. So it affected his brain. Some people think that he even had a brain tumor as well. So he kind of went crazy himself. He deserted his missionary post.
Was that Father Maurice? Or
that was Maurice.
Oh, that's Maurice.
Yeah. He deserted his missionary post. Now this is all after Thérèse died. Returned to France. He was then convened to the general chapter of the White Fathers, who didn't really scold him because they knew he had fragile mental health. But they said, listen, you have to go back to Africa. No one asked you to come back here. In the meantime, he fell even more gravely sick. He was sent to Belgium to a kind of a retiring place, or a place for, a medical center, as it were, for missionary priests in Belgium. But the doctor there told him, listen, you have to go back to France. There's a better climate for your health. So just go back to France. So he went back to France, moved in with his mother, who was actually his adoptive mother. She shortly thereafter died, and he was found a few months later wandering aimlessly through the countryside in Normandy, in France. He had basically gone crazy. He was then entered into the same hospital where Thérèse's father had been interned for 3 years, in the psychiatric ward of the Bon Sauveur Hospital in Caen. So he had kind of the same fate as Thérèse's father, and he died at 33 years of age. So he considered his life a failure, but I think it wasn't, because he died at the same age of Jesus. In the hospital where Thérèse's dad had been, had stayed. And I think there's something very paradoxical about that, but it wasn't his fault, So Thérèse was with him from the beginning to the end,
And the other priest that went.
The other priest had inversely had a brilliant career. So he went to China. He went to China and was a parish priest first he taught in the seminary, in the major seminary, then the minor seminary. He was appreciated for that. Then he became a parish priest for a number of years and constructed 20 schools in the area for the kids. So did a lot of good, a lot of baptisms and conversions and stuff. So he had a brilliant career. But after only, I don't remember how many years, not that many years, he was called back to France, which he didn't want, but he obeyed. He was called back and became the rector of the seminary of the Foreign Societies missionaries, his own order. So he was the rector of the seminary for a number of years. Then he was the treasurer. He was a chaplain. So his remaining years he lived in France. But he was, he had important roles in his order and was very successful. He died peacefully at 64 years of age, I think. So kind of an opposite story. He was also a stronger, kind of more sure in his ways. Bellier was always kind of hesitant, a little scrupulous, not too sure. And Thérèse really comforted him and helped him and encouraged Rouland.
In those letters, did she give advice on how to be a good priest or what he should do?
Definitely. Well, she mostly responded to his questions, which a lot of time were focused on God's justice. It's good to learn more about Thérèse's little way, to read the letters, because she was trying to, in the short amount of time she knew she had, she was trying to sort of convert him to her little way. And she says that explicitly. She says, I hope someday you'll follow my little way. And was really trying to help Maurice Bellier to kind of get over his scrupulosity and to understand the depth of God's mercy and his love for him.
What does it mean? We're just jumping around here.
That's okay.
What does it mean, and why do you think she was declared a doctor of the church?
Good question. So she was proclaimed a doctor of the Scientia Amoris, the science of love. which is what she writes about in her manuscript B, which was a love letter that she wrote to Jesus of her own accord on the 6th anniversary of her final vows as a nun. So she wrote this big long letter to Jesus, and her sister Marie, Miss Marie of the Sacred Heart, her eldest sister, asked her to share her secrets that Jesus had been revealing to her as well. So Thérèse added a short introductory letter and just attached the letter she had written to Jesus during her retreat. And that would later become manuscript B. And that's where she talks about the science of love, and that's where she speaks about her exploration of St. Paul's letters and how she found an answer to her desires in St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, which speaks about the greatest of gifts, which is charity. And that's when she, discovers her vocation in her vocation. So not only Carmelite, but also to be love in the heart of the church. And that's the science of love that she asked Jesus to reveal to all, especially to all little souls. So they probably took that catchphrase because doctors generally have a science to teach, right? But her science is the science of love. Yeah. Her being proclaimed a doctor was pretty debated for quite a while. I think the Dominicans, for a while, were not favorable because they have St. Thomas Aquinas and stuff, and he has a different way of exposing theological doctrine. Much more systematical, much more important. Which is okay. But finally, her doctorate prevailed. So I think she's a doctor for the world today. She's not systematic. She's not a theologian. But she's a theologian not so much by her writings, but by her life, expressed through her writings.
And I've heard it described too that the doctors proclaim, they're teaching something, and that it resonated with people. It was effective, right, in people.
Right. So to be proclaimed a doctor of the church, you have to have a number of prerequisites. One is eminent virtue. So not only heroic virtue, but eminent virtue. So like a virtue that's outstanding among other saints. Mm-hmm. You also have to have a universal influence. So she definitely has both of those. In fact, if you see there's the positio, so there's the kind of huge thesis that was written by various experts of Thérèse for her doctorate, her being proclaimed a doctor of the church. And there's hundreds of pages, I believe, dedicated to her influence in the entire universal church from her death until today. So countless, congregations have been inspired by her spirituality, all the copies of the Story of a Soul. It's hard to find a church in the world without her statue, so she's everywhere,
And you see scripture throughout Story of the Soul. That's a very modern thing in one sense. I mean, that return to the sources, Vatican II, the Catechism really tries to emphasize this.
Absolutely. She, contrarily to the custom of her time, she was really imbued with scriptures. She had Céline, while she was already a nun. Céline was in the world. Céline later joined her. But in the meantime, Thérèse asked Céline to bind a copy of the Gospels for her, to have it specially bound, a small version that she could carry around. And Céline did that, and she said, this is too big. You have to make me a small one. So she did that, and she kept that always on her heart. She says that herself, and we know that. She kept she had a pouch with like lots of little things inside, with a stamp of our Holy Face of Tours with her most brief prayer, "Make me resemble you." That's the shortest prayer she wrote. So, "Make me resemble you." So the Holy Face of Jesus. She had a number of relics in there. She had all kinds of things, and she also kept the Gospels always on her heart, and she would often take them out and read them. So her writings are full of the Gospel passages, and she was kind of like St. Francis in the sense that everything she wrote out of memory by heart. So when she quotes the Gospels, she's quoting by heart. And she's also drawing a lot on the liturgy of the hours, just like St. Francis did from the breviary and stuff. So she's drawing from antiphons, from the liturgy of the hours. She's drawing from random things she's heard along the way. She didn't systematically study the Bible, and again, it was not the common usage to read the Bible, especially the Old Testament. Surprisingly, the cloistered nuns of her time did not really read the Bible. That's the late 1800s in France. So there was a copy of the Bible in the library, but no one went and sat down and read it. She was really struck by some passages of the Old Testament, which Celine had copied down because the Martin family had 2 copies of the entire Bible. And Celine, when she entered in 1894, brought her so-called black notebook with quite a number of Old Testament passages that had struck her. Thérèse immediately asked her for this notebook and read through it. That's when she discovered Isaiah and Proverbs and 2 passages that really catalyzed her and were kind of the last drop or the last spark for her little way. That is the prophet Isaiah, which says, "As a mother caresses her child, and the child suckles on her breast, so I will caress you." And also the book of Proverbs, which says, "If anyone is little, let him come to me." So these 2 passages really struck Thérèse and became kind of the final confirmation of her little way. That was the end of 1894. And in fact, she starts, her doctrine really developed in that time period, and that's when she starts writing about, that's when the first glimpses of the little way start coming out in a more explicit way in her writings.
Now, you've written, you did some doctoral work on John of the Cross and Thérèse.
Yes.
Tell us a little about that. What from John of the Cross did she really grab a hold of?
That's another fascinating story. So I would condense it into 3 main points, but there's a lot more could be said, but let's just go with 3 main points. But first of all, it has to be said that so before entering Carmel, she knew almost nothing of John of the Cross, but she knew one of his phrases, which is the famous phrase when he was praying in a church in front of a crucifix, St. John of the Cross, and the Lord spoke to him saying, "You have served me well, what do you desire?" And he desired to suffer and be despised for you, O Lord. Very strong response. He was shortly after sent to a convent where his superior basically hated him and mistreated him. So he got what he asked for, But Thérèse was struck by that phrase. We're not sure where she heard it from. Could be from one of the homilies. There was the liturgical commentaries of Dom Guéranger, who was a Benedictine monk. So every evening, Louis Martin would take his little Thérèse, put her on his lap, and they would, together with the other daughters, they would read this commentary on the word of the day. So perhaps she heard her father read a short biography of St. John of the Cross, but that's not certain. Anyway, she picked up on this phrase, maybe from other sources anyway. I don't want to get too depth in this. There's a book that her father had borrowed from the library of the monastery, The Ascent of Mount Carmel, and opening that book up, there's the picture of St. John of the Cross and the phrase, "Lord, to suffer and be despised for you." So and also in the parlor, there was written on the wall of the Lisieux Carmel, "Lord, to suffer and be despised for you." So that's probably where she picked it up. Her and Celine would often talk about it in the evening when they were sitting on the windowsill and talking about Jesus. They would often quote this phrase. So it had struck her from her earliest childhood. But that's not the most important thing. When she enters, shortly after her father's illness, shortly after he is interned in the hospital in the psychiatric ward, about a month after, she starts quoting St. John of the Cross. So my hypothesis is that in that month, she borrowed the book. Now we know that she had the book. It's not certain from what time period, but I think it's then, because that's when she starts quoting him, like various passages of his. Right. So she had something on her hand. Yeah. In that month of time, she was obviously looking for light, for inspiration, for a guide, and she found that in St. John of the Cross. So she borrowed the Spiritual Canticle and the Living Flame of Love. She kept that volume with her from her 16 years of age until her death. Even in the infirmary, it's one of the books that was on the bedside table when she died.
It had been written in French?
It was in French, okay. Yes. So the nuns from Paris had translated it about 20 years before she was born. She read right through that. She quotes a lot of that. There's a bookmark of her own with the passages that had most struck her. There's crosses in that book that she herself made in the passages that most struck her. So she poured over that, and also I think she also read the Sound of Mount Carmel and the Dark Night of the Soul, which was also in their library. So that really influenced her. And just 3 main points, just really quickly. So first of all, let me think. So one is the death of love. One is spiritual matrimony. And what was the other point that's important?
Suffering or something?
It'll come to me. Spousal love for Jesus. So again, I think we talked about her spousal love for Jesus. That's very important for her. And he really educated that part of her life. So St. John of the Cross speaks about this spousal love, So that's one important thing. The second important thing, spiritual matrimony. That's John of the Cross's his big message, I mean, the whole preparation, the Dark Night of the Soul, that's maybe the most evocative image that John of the Cross uses. That's what everyone talks about. But that's really only the passageway to arrive to spiritual matrimony, which is the most important thing for him, which he says, that's the highest state, mystical state that a soul can reach on this earth, spiritual matrimony. And I'm convinced that Thérèse reached that mystical state. It's not so much a phenomenon like stigmata might be, or bilocation, or levitation, and all those interesting phenomena. It's more of a state of the soul, Even the Catechism of the Catholic Church says purgatory is a state of the soul, not so much a place, and even heaven, So it's a state of the soul that has reached the most mature state that it can reach in this life, aided and followed by God's grace. I think she lived that shortly after her offering to God's merciful love. She talks about being, at a certain point, she was making her way of the cross. She said, I was plunged into like a fire of love. And she said, what sweetness, what fire together. If it had endured only a few more seconds, I probably would have died. She says this in her last months to Pauline. But she also adds, I loved God so much before that, but after that, it was not at all the way I loved him after that. So she talks about a before and after, which corresponds to John of the Cross's experience and teachings. The last point, the death of love, when she realized she would die in 1894, 3 years before her death, she's almost immediately afterwards started writing about a death of love. In February 1895, she wrote her poem, Living on Love. And the last 3 stanzas are dedicated to dying of love. And she keeps repeating that in her writings until she dies. But the most significant point is that I think it was in July or August, so a few months before she died, she was constantly looking at her crucifix, right? She was holding it in her hand in the infirmary. That was her constant companion. And she says, I'm not experiencing the death of love like St. John of the Cross spoke about. She doesn't say that explicitly, but she says, I'll tell you quite frankly, she says to Pauline, I don't think that the death of love is dying in transports and in the midst of ecstasies, but you see, the most beautiful death of love is that of Jesus, and he did not die in the midst of ecstasies, And she said, I think that's what I'm living. So she sees that there was a contrast between John of the Cross's description of the death of love, which is like this final ecstasy of transport and delight, where the soul is detached from the body, And she said, that's not what I'm living. So she's trying to find an answer to that, and she turns to Christ, and she sees the crucifix in her hands, and she says, he lived the best death of love, and that's what she's living. But the funny thing is, when she died, she did live this final ecstasy, because her sisters talk about it. They say that her last words looking at a crucifix were, my God, I love you. So she made this final act of love. She falls back with her head on the pillow, but her gaze is turned upward, and she's just taken with this expression of love, just gazing at someone, probably Jesus, I think. And the nuns even say they took a candle and placed it in front of her eyes, and her eyelids were not moving at all. For the entire space of a creed, so the time it takes to recite the creed, probably a minute and a half, a couple minutes, she was not blinking. She was just looking straight at something. And then she closed her eyes.
They have a picture of that, right? Don't they?
That's right after her death.
So
right after her death, she closes her, so she falls back in the pillow, closes her eyes, and she dies. So she actually did live the death of love that Saint John of the Cross had described and that she had desired.
Oh, okay. So just before dying, she
did live that, yeah.
Okay. And what about the night, right? The trial of faith, that seems very John of the Cross, like, all these nights of purgation.
Yeah.
And how do we understand that? How does that?
Well, a lot of people think that Therese's trial of faith was like the dark night of the soul described by St. John of the Cross. Mm-hmm. I disagree. That's not how she expresses herself. Mm-hmm. So I think we should not project on her, our own way of seeing things, but try to listen to her. She talks about purifying sinners with being together with them. That's not what the dark night of the soul is about. The dark night of the soul is the soul being purified by God. But she had already been purified. That's what I think. So hers is a participation, of course, in a subordinate way. Our only Redeemer is Christ. But he somehow participated to her in a special way. She was able to collaborate with Jesus in a special way, and with her offering, she wrote in her manuscript C, the story of a soul, "If you want, Lord, that I keep eating the bread of sorrows, sitting at the table of sinners, my brothers," she calls them, "so that they may be cleansed, then that's also what I want." So she herself realized that she was contributing to the purification of others, not of herself.
Right.
She had already been purified, and I think if she lived the dark night of the soul, I think she did. You can find that in her earlier writings. Mm-hmm. So in the first years of her novitiate in Carmel, I think her dark night kicked in when her father fell ill.
Yeah.
That was one of the worst sufferings of her life. She speaks about herself, her egoism being emptied of the sensible pleasures of this life when her father fell ill. She spoke about that in a letter to Celine. So there are some clues. She speaks about going through a dark tunnel before making her profession. So some of those clues of the dark night, which are more explicit and more according to John of the Cross's doctrine, are much earlier.
Yeah. So is there, I forgot the term for it, but there's like a redemptive quality that she's suffering this for others, right? Like you said, this darkness. And it seems like to me I would fit the saint of modern times, that we live in this era of atheism that's, some have said, are unique to our, everybody, usually all these different cultures, right, believe in something. It might be pagan idols or whatever. We are embracing more and more an atheism. It's really ushered in, I guess, the 20th century with philosophers and things. And so she's taken upon herself that to suffer for faith, right? For people to have faith.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think she was kind of the response to the atheism of her time, and maybe even for today's, for sure. Yeah, that's the pure faith, and she lived pure faith. What's striking, even her spiritual motherhood. Let me just quote this episode, which I find very telling. She was so the bell had rung that in the monastery. That meant that you had to move on to the next task, right? So the first bell had rung. They only had a few minutes to move over to the washing room to wash the sheets, So she was called to do that together with Sister Mary of the Trinity, who was a novice of hers at the time. So Sister Mary of the Trinity was sort of leisurely just kind of picking flowers in the courtyard in the garden of the monastery, although she had heard the bell, So she was supposed to have left everything and run over, whisk off to the laundry room. Well, Thérèse passed by at a quick pace and turned to her and dragged her away from the flowers and said, "Is that how a mother who has hungry children would go about feeding her children?" She said, "We must go because our children have need of us." So she realized that by washing the laundry, she was feeding souls, and that would be her spiritual children. But what's all the more striking about this is the fact that she never saw any of them.
Right.
But there's so many of them today.
Right.
So she just lived that pure faith in every way.
Right. And she is patron of missionaries and never leaving Carmel, right?
Yeah, really.
And
Yeah.
so offering all these things up for the missionaries or for people's faith to grow. And let me ask you this, there's a couple more questions. I don't know why I wonder about what her life was like growing up. Right, her father was a watchmaker.
Watchmaker, yeah, yeah.
Would he actually make or would repair them, or he'd actually make watch?
So I know he had a watch. I think all right, let me think. So he went to Paris to perfect his trade. He was a watchmaker, so I think he constructed them, obviously repaired them. He also had a jewelry shop, so it was a watchmaker / jewelry shop.
Okay.
He closed that every Sunday, which was highly detrimental to his business, but he did that out of respect for the day of repose. His spiritual director had even said to him, "You listen, as far as I'm concerned, you can keep it open," but he said no.
Were they middle class? Or?
High middle class. So he was very successful in his business, and his wife was even more successful in her business. She was making the Alençon lace, which was very highly fashionable at the time. All the women in Paris were asking for it. So she had a number of women workers who would make this lace, and she had this special way of stitching it together, which like a hidden stitch. So they would make like these 30-meter, 100-meter long rolls of this special, very finely handmade lace, and they would send that off to Paris.
Right. And in the monastery, she was living with some difficult personalities, right?
Definitely.
I know, it's kind of consoling to us, I think, to people. It's like, well, if you had to live with the people I'd live with, you'd get angry too, or you would. And yet she, you wouldn't really know it from her, right? I mean, she talked about being splashed in the laundry or something.
Right.
But it goes well beyond that, right? Some of the
Definitely
difficulties she had.
I mean, she was given all the leftovers, Like sometimes her sister Celine testifies to the fact that sometimes on her plate she would have nothing more than a few herring fish heads and some eggs that had been refried the past 3 days. So it was a poor monastery. They just lived on Providence, and she never complained. So they all thought that she was happy, that she happily ate everything. But she didn't. She just did it. She just accepted God's will as it was presented to her, And she never complained, so they thought that she liked it.
Right.
Or at least that's what's said. There was also a nun who usually gave her the leftovers, so there was obviously some antipathy going on and some jealousy. I think some of them were jealous of her. There was also, the monastery was quite divided because there was the Martin clan, so-called Martin clan.
3 sisters.
4 sisters and a cousin, so there's 5 of them in the end.
Okay.
There was Marie, Pauline, Thérèse, Celine, and also their cousin Marie.
Okay.
So the Martin clan was growing over time, and then there was the Mother Marie de Gonzague, the prioress kind of clan, So it was kind of a 2-sided monastery, and there was kind of this hidden tension underneath. And then, a lot of them, many of them had never studied. They were kind of rude characters. They were kind of gruff. She was very delicate. She was raised to kind of not noble, but kind of bourgeois, high rung of society, and she wasn't used to being treated without delicacy. Right. So that was painful to her. And for example, there was a sister. She was clumsy. Thérèse was clumsy in doing things. They had to make sandals in the monastery. So there was a sister who was a lot better at doing that, and she would often make biting remarks about Thérèse out loud so that everyone could hear her, and Thérèse would also hear her. But the only way she ever responded was just smiling at her. After a number of years, the sister commented on her remarkable virtue. So people recognized her, even the nuns recognized her virtue. Not all of them realized it, but they thought it was just natural for her. They thought she was just goody. They thought she was pampered by her sisters, but actually she would avoid her sisters. In recreation, whenever they had a free moment, her sisters would gather together. She would avoid them to not give in to natural feelings. In fact, just one last episode, her sister Marie, who was the eldest, wanted to teach her the breviary, how to use the breviary. Therese had entered only a couple weeks. And so Therese responded. So Marie said to her, "Why don't you come and sit next to me as we pray Liturgy of the Hours in the choir? I'll teach you how to use the breviary." And Therese responded, "Actually, I just learned this morning." And then she said, "But it would be better for us to keep apart for love of Jesus. I did not come here to find my family." So she lived an opposite life than what had appeared.
Right. Let me ask you about one sister. Was it Leonie that had like wasn't one of her sisters had some kind of mental anguish a little bit, or?
I think many of them did.
This is like a blood sister.
Oh, okay.
Like she entered another order, didn't she?
So that was Leonie.
Yeah.
She's kind of the ugly duckling of the family.
Yeah.
But the paradoxical thing is that the only other sibling whose cause has been open is Leonie's.
Really?
She's well on her way. I don't know at what point she is, but she's not venerable yet, but I think she will be soon.
Yeah.
She was the ugliest, well, she was the least attractive physically.
Mm-hmm.
She was the least talented, the least intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
She struggled the most with her vocation. So she went in and out of the Visitant nuns 3 or 4 times. She went to the Poor Clares, came back. Every time she would stay there for a while and then come back home. Finally, she remained with the Visitandines, and she remained there her whole life. I think she started kind of below 0, but then she went up to 10 because maybe she was the only one who really understood Therese's little way. I think she was humble and she was less talented, and so maybe that was a good nesting place for Therese's little way. What was the question?
That was just it. I just wanted I didn't know. For some reason I thought that she had some kind of rough edges or something, maybe some difficulties. But
I think she did. I'm not sure about mental anguish.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
All right, this is the last question. Okay. When you work with people, hear confessions, you're from upstate New York, you're living in Italy now. What do you find yourself? What's the most common advice you're giving maybe in confession to people to help them from Thérèse?
From Thérèse? Good question. I don't know if I have common advice from Thérèse. I mean, I often quote saints. I don't really have any specific quote that comes to mind. Whatever pops into my mind that comes in hand, really, according to their problems and stuff.
Yeah.
Nothing really comes to mind.
Yeah, right. All right, well, thank you so much for talking with us. We worked you to death today, and appreciate your generosity.
Glad to do that. Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much.